This is part two of the City of Newcastle finances timeline going back to 2020 all the way up to some current events this year in 2025. If you have not seen part one, to give more clarity and context to why I'm talking about what I'm talking about today, and also more clarity on the context of what we're talking about, you can go back and view part one, but you don't necessarily need to read or to listen to part one to get a picture of what we're talking about. So I want to jump right in because there's a whole lot of information. Again, what started this was a quote or a comment, a statement made by Councilman Coger in a meeting that just took place in October of last year, right before passing the 2025 budget for the city of Newcastle. He made this statement: I'm telling you, this is what has happened for the last 6.5 years. So again, what significant event took place approximately 6.5 years ago that pertains to the health insurance fund, the annual budget, and the city deficit? Okay, so here we go. We got to go back to the past. We can begin to show this developing pattern from an article dated June 17, 2020, titled "Council Accuses Mayor, Former Clerk Treasurer of Unethical Accounting." The article states, according to Council President Rex Peckinpah, that the Finance Committee had discovered that some things have been going on for quite some time that are at best unethical. And then he goes on to describe a lot of money shuffling from funds to funds. Then he stated this: we have functioned under the idea that the mayor has been doing a great job of doing a lot with a little, and came to find out that basically Peter was being robbed to pay Paul. One of the issues that sparked this controversy was the shuffling of money and the realization that the health insurance fund was a negative $4.9 million in 2020. The mayor's explanation, he made a statement that has actually become a part of our pattern. York said, this is a quote in the article, York said, the SBOA, State Board of Accounts, has checked the city books every year and we've passed with flying colors. Again, this is in 2020. Mayor York then stated there's not a nickel that's came out of that money for the last month, for the last 4 months, that you guys haven't approved. Okay, very specific timeline. I don't know if he was being specific or he was just talking. However, this statement is interesting because in a 2023 attempt to refute my campaign comments on this particular council meeting from back in 2020, Council President made this statement: the mayor was not getting an accurate account of the money he had available in accounts he was allowed to spend money from without council approval. In other words, he was going about, again, we're quoting the newspaper article or the statement, he was going about doing the job of mayor and spending money he thought he could spend based on the knowledge he had at his disposal. He did not spend any money on anything the council would not have approved. Mayor York was just never informed by the clerk treasurer of that time that he was moving into an area where he needed to seek approval. What's interesting is the mayor stated not a nickel was spent without council approval for approximately the last 4 months. Again, specific timeline, I don't know. But what's crazy is when Mr. Peckinpah reflected upon that specific meeting in 2023 during the election, he stated that the council did not approve the questioned spending, but would have. Again, we're establishing patterns here. There is more to this pattern, but let's look at another councilman's statement during this meeting. This is, again, referencing the meeting that took place in June of 2020. This comes from Councilman Mark Coger, the one who said this has been going on for 6.5 years. Recently, in a recent meeting, That same councilman that recently brought this issue to the public again just a few months ago, this is the statement that got me thinking about all this. Councilman Cogar is quoted in this June 2020 article this way: "Wool pulled over our eyes," he said. "The way the money had been moved around didn't paint a real picture of the city's finances, and the council made bad choices based on bad information." Cogar said the city's budget only looked good because public safety LOIT money was being included in the figures when it shouldn't be. He referred to it as a shell game. The public safety LOIT, that is the specific income tax that the council and city has voted on 2 different times. I was actually part of the first time that voted to take income tax specifically designed to enhance public safety. Councilman Cogar goes on to say this in the June of 2020 meeting: "We were too stupid as a council to realize that with the wool being pulled over our eyes." So let me say this differently so you get it in context. We were too stupid as a council to realize that, okay, to realize the money shuffling. With the wool being pulled over our eyes, we have been blindsided. The term blindsided will come up again later by another council member in time to come. Then there is more proof to my contentious statements about the money shuffling that has been taking place. Again, I've been talking about this for a long time. In the same article, it is reported that the clerk treasurer at that time said, if it wasn't for having the public safety LOIT money, the separate income tax for public safety, the riverboat money that comes from gambling that comes into the city, and the rainy day money, the extra money that's been saved up for emergencies, in the bank account, they wouldn't be able to pay the health insurance bills. So again, proving there's money shuffling. All right. So again, this is a statement that I said way back that everybody was throwing a fit about. I was misleading people, but they actually admitted all this before I even made those statements. That's why I made those statements. I was using their statements as proof. The council then made an official attempt to separate these funds in such a way that they cannot be so easily commingled with the other funds. Okay, so they're like, hey, we have a problem. Let's solve it. Then Councilman Peckable at the time, who was recognizing the issue and was making an attempt to correct the issue at that time, wanted to create an ordinance that kept all these funds separate so they couldn't be so easily shuffled. Okay. However, to this motion, Councilman Lynn Perdue voted against it. According to the article, Perdue said moving that money out will cripple the city government. So if we don't have the ability to shuffle all this money, it will cripple city government. The budget is too tight to not have the ability to move money easily. Having concerns about the financial health of the city, a representative from our city council's or from the city's financial advisory firm, Baker Tilly, who was present at that meeting, said this: based on the current weekly payroll costs along with medical payments out of the health fund and other costs which need to be paid to keep the city running, it would be only a matter of weeks before the cash in Bank One funds would run out. This is the big bank fund. This is the big account that has like 70 plus different funds in it, including EMS fund, including health insurance fund, multiple other funds. Again, as long as it's all these funds are in one bank account, they could just write checks out of the bank account, and the bank account balance may be there, but the fund balances begin to deplete. Then, according to the article, he said, this is again representative from Baker Tilly, that would be detrimental to the city's ability to operate. Newcastle would likely have to take out loans, this is in 2020, to keep the city running if those funds were moved to separate accounts. Again, the article then reported the clerk treasurer of that time saying, the city is looking at changes in the employee health insurance plan, that could include higher premiums or spousal carve-outs. The city EMS service might also become self-funding, okay, 2020, freeing up $1.5 million a year for the health fund. So what she meant by that is evidently before the city EMS was completely self-funding, a portion of what the EMS brought in was put into the other, general fund, other accounts. And then the city EMS employees' health insurance was paid out of that. However, now, to my understanding, since they decided that the EMS department would be a self-operating department, 100% of the revenue comes into that department. And then, to my understanding, the EMS department then pays for their own employees' health insurance. So, Brenda Grider, the clerk treasurer at that time, said this: in 2 years, we should be able to pretty much take care of the health fund savings. Again, 2020. Continuing the discussion of the separation of funds, Perdue stated, "But I don't want the council to get in a position where we have to ask her, why do you need the money? That's not our job." To which Councilman Pecapol replied, "If all of a sudden she needs $250,000, we ought to know why. If we've had a budget shortfall, if we've had something break, what's wrong with us knowing why? Is there something with us knowing why, Lynn?" I agree with Councilman Pecapol. There's nothing wrong with the council knowing and having an understanding of the city budget and what they're doing so that they're not blindsided. Then here's what's interesting. Councilman Pecapol says this, which I agree with this statement that he made back in 2020. Our job is to be a fiscal representative of the people. Councilman Pecapol said that. Our job is to be a fiscal or financial representative of the people. However, according to Councilman Perdue, he said our job is to approve the budget. It's the mayor's job and our department head's job to keep that budget in line. Then later he added this to the Courier Times reporter. We approve, again, talking about Councilman Lynn Perdue, we approve the budget at the beginning of every fiscal year, and it's the mayor's job to keep the department heads to their agreed to budgets. Okay? True statement. Again, in 2020, in a Courier Times article titled Deferring Accounts of the City Finances, Councilman Pecapol continued to express his concern and feeling of responsibility over the budget expenditures, stating this: we're still responsible to the public for what happens with those funds. Again, 100% agree with Councilman Pecapol. Though they are restricted on their ability to have some type of authority over the spending, they still represent and still are responsible to the public for what happens with those funds. They are the stopgap, if you will, every year during the budget. And they are also our ambassadors, so that during public meetings, they can state, here is what's wrong. I want the public to know, right? Which is what Councilman Pecapol and Councilman Coger did back in 2020. So then Councilman Coger speaks up again, talking specifically about that public safety income tax. It's just that they've been using that at their own free spending on whatever came about and whatever bill came forward. That wasn't what that money was intended for. That money was intended to be kept separate for emergency services, not for an administration, not for a clerk treasurer to spend that money on any bill that came through just because they are receiving at the time, $970,000 a year from the public safety LOIT. 100% agree with Mr. Coger on this. That money is very specific. The article continues with the plea from the clerk treasurer. I'm asking you, again, this is Brenda Grider, clerk treasurer at the time. I'm asking you to have faith in me to do what I'm going to do. I'm 6 months into this job. She just took over. This has to be the worst year ever to step into this position. And then Councilman Peckinpah says this, or here's a quote from the article. This is a quote directly from the article. "I'm just going to be blunt. It's not that we don't trust you, it's that we don't trust him," Peckinpah said, referring to Mayor York. "He doesn't sign the checks," Grider replied. "Yes, but he goes out and spends money," Peckinpah said. Okay, those are direct quotes from that article, not my opinion. So your head may be spinning right now, but let's go back. We're recapping 2020. Here is what we know so far that happened in 2020. A huge shortfall was developing in the health insurance fund prior to 2020. Money was being shuffled around from the fund to cover expenses. Baker Tilly representatives stated that the city may need to borrow money to keep the city running. The EMS department, which is important now because that's where they're laying off employees, became self-funding, so they would begin to cover their own insurance costs. We were told that in 2 years, remember this was in June of 2020, in 2 years the health insurance fund should be taken care of. Okay, that would have made it June 2022 roughly, but we'll see what happened in 2022. Councilman Peckinpah stated, "Our job is to be a fiscal representative of the people," and he publicly expressed a lack of trust in the administration. This is all in 2020. Councilman Perdue stated, "We approve the budget at the beginning of every fiscal year, and it's the mayor's job to keep the department heads to their agreed-to budgets." Councilman Coger stated, "The way money has been moved around didn't paint a real picture of the city's finances, and the council made bad choices based on bad information." Okay, so that's in June of 2020. Months go on. In 2021, we still see this pattern continue. In a piece specifically written by Councilman Peckinpah himself, titled, "Maybe Mr. White Should Look in the Mirror," and making a reference to the Courier Times editor, Travis White, on some statements he had made concerning some backlash. This is what Mr. Peckinpah was talking about. He wrote this article himself specifically about some backlash received on Ordinance 3827 that had to do with trash totes. Again, a lot of history there. You can go back and look at it. But here's what's important to our pattern we're developing in the specific area of finances for the city of Newcastle. Peckinpah himself writes, "When the mayor ignored and violated more than one ordinance last year," he's saying this in 2021, speaking of 2020, "the Courier did not recognize it as being wrong. Now, when I present an idea to get us moving on something that has been brought up to the mayor numerous times," and he goes on to explain how he's now receiving backlash. Then he adds this, again, he's writing this in his own words, "I was also accused of calling the mayor names. I did call him a deflector, which I feel he is, and I think is evident. I also said several times that he is not a leader. I think he fails as a leader on several counts." Again, this was directly written by Councilman Peckinpah approximately 6 months after the previous comments about unethical actions. So this has been carrying on, this feeling, this perception, this attitude of what's going on is continued. Okay, so things, they go fairly quiet and they settle down for the next year or so. But then as the end of 2022 begins, the city's financial troubles begin to surface again as the next city election comes into view. And Councilman Rex Peckinpah's perspective on the administration begins to change. This is where we see the beginning of some changes of attitude and some changes of perspective on things, how things have been over the past couple years. Now it starts to change. So that will be the subject of our next video, part 3. Again, bringing up a lot of bad history, a lot of stuff that during the 2023 election we were told to ignore because it was old information. However, the reason I brought it up is because I could tell, according to the books, that information that was being given out back then was actually very pertinent. It applied very much to the current situation we were facing in 2023 because it showed the pattern and the direction we were headed. However, we were told to ignore that because it was old information. And then in 2023, we were told everything was great. However, I knew that in time to come, the truth would unravel, and we will pick up in time to come here, probably in part 3, where we will see where the council members after the election begin to say more things like what they were saying prior to the election. So again, this timeline I think is very important because your history shows where you're going, and we are, all of us are accountable to what we say and do. We can't just say and do things and then just say, well, ignore that, because I've changed my mind. No, it does matter. There's a reason you were saying it. There was a reason you were doing it. And there's a reason you changed your mind, right? So those are all reasonable, right? Sometimes we change our mind. But why did you change your mind? And did you change your mind because things are getting better? That would be a reasonable thing. But what we saw in 2024 and 2025 clearly showed us things were not getting better. And even some of the councilmen begin to acknowledge that. So we'll pick up there. And this is just information, not trying to show malice. I'm just using quotes, using data, using their own words. A lot of people are picking up, a lot of new people are picking up on this information, so they don't quite understand how we got here. Well, there's a reason, and there's a clear pattern. So, and if you see that pattern, maybe and recognize that pattern, maybe we can in the future do better. But I do believe there's some very hard times to come.